Hi everyone, it's Professor Hall. Welcome back. Today we are talking about setting, and we're going to look at where a story takes place and how to build a setting as an author. So we will talk about the four major components of setting, and we'll give some details about each one. Then I'll give you some examples for each of those things, how to give a few details here and there, and then we'll look at maybe creating an example that includes all of those aspects. So let's get started. Component number one is environment. And things that you might want to consider in your basic environment. We have topography. Topography basically means the arrangement of various environmental, for lack of a better term, structures, sort of like the dictionary definition. So that would include things like, there we go, mountains, rivers, forests, deserts, Arctic areas, etc. Those kind of things. What kind of vegetation do we have? I'll add that. After the etc.? No. Come on now. What do the trees look like? What do the mountains look like? Where is the mountain in relation to the river? That kind of thing. Geography has a lot of different components. Geography is kind of the study of the world and the environment and the atmosphere, that kind of thing. But what I'd like you to kind of consider as a writer are the ways that the physical world has been affected by humans, or if your story is non-human, by whatever creatures are living there. So things like the borders of nations. Where cities lie, the land use, industry, those types of things. Now, you're not going to need all of these in every story, but I just kind of want to give you some examples of what you could include in an environment, especially if you are creating an environment. These things are pretty important. What I mean by that is if you're setting it in a fantasy world or in the future or those kind of things, this can kind of be helpful. So what are some other environmental things? What do the buildings look like? Where do people live? How do they travel? Buildings and roads, just some basic things. Just the general look of the place. Yeah, so let's have some examples. Those are things that kind of would go into an environment. Do we have a beach house on the ocean? That's our setting, right? Do we have a small town in a desert with a difficult, that's not the term I want, with a mountain range between the town and the lake? And then maybe that mountain range is treacherous and difficult to get across, and that kind of adds to that setting. Maybe you have something in an American high school, and there are certain things that looks like. Maybe it's run down and it has no air conditioning, and half the buildings are those temporary buildings they put outside, right? Those would be some of the setting details, the look of the place that you would add. So, yeah, that's the environment, right? You're in a restaurant. You're on a crowded street. You're maybe you have several scenes in several different settings, but the general the next part, the time period, the time period is kind of the same. So when does your story take place? Is this now? Is this 200 years ago? Is it 1,000 years from today? You need to think about a lot of different details. I guess I can put these all in one line. A lot of different details depending on when your story takes place. There are things to consider, and some of them we're going to get into in a minute when we talk about the other components of setting. But just as an example, let's say your story takes place in 100 years ago. Let's say it takes place in 1921. So, what are people like in this time period? What do they do for fun? How many of them have cars? It's pretty early on. We might not have everybody being able to drive, depending on how much money they have. What do they do for work? A lot of jobs that exist now that did not then. You're not going to have anyone be in 1921 a social influencer, though you might have them be a model. You know, think about what school was like. Think about family structures, how those might be different. Maybe it's a little bit more patriarchal, that kind of thing. What people did for exercise is quite different. You're in the realm of let's walk outside, let's go play golf. Golf was a big kind of new sport at that point. Calisthenics was something that people were doing. You don't find many people doing calisthenics now. Certainly maybe walking or going for a game of golf, but those types of things would need to be in that time period. What they're wearing, right? Their houses look like. Do we have Art Deco quite yet? I don't know. But their houses would be quite different. You can think about the technology, all of those kinds of time period details. There might even be some slang. I think I mentioned this in another lecture. My favorite thing from the 1920s is 23 skidoo. I love that phrase. I think we should try to find a way to bring it back. I do not know what it means, but I think it's kind of funny. They have known World War I. They've not known World War II. They're hoping that this is going to be a time of prosperity, and then the Great Depression comes not that much later, right? So do we have a sense of innocence because of that? Do we have a sense of cynical nature because, if you have somebody who's in their 20s, they maybe in their 30s, they've lived through the war, maybe they fought in the war, those types of things are going to come up. Now, the length of time, sometimes people put this in and they say there's 3 things. I like to kind of separate them out. What length of time does your story span? That's a weird way of putting it, but that's essentially what I mean. So, for example, you can have, there's a great story called The Story of an Hour. You could have it take place during an hour. You could have it take place over decades. Some of this might depend on the length of work that you are writing, and some of it might depend on the story itself. If you think about something like Forrest Gump, that took place over several decades. If you think about, we just read Harrison Bergeron, that takes place just in one evening, right? So maybe it's a few minutes, maybe it's a day, maybe it's a week, whatever the case may be. Maybe you have flashbacks and flash forwards where it kind of extends the length of time for your story. I'm thinking of the show Twin Peaks. The original show had this conceit, this setup that each episode would take place in one day in this town, and they had to kind of drop that because too much stuff was taking place. And so initially they had planned out that this would happen on a Monday, and then this would be on a Tuesday, then a couple episodes later would be on a Saturday, so the students would not be in school, things like that. And then half the town is embroiled in scandal, and they can't really keep that up. So you have to really think about what length of time works for your story, and do those time period details change? If you're going from, say, 2001 to 2021, there's going to be a lot of details there in terms of people using the internet, people using cell phones, sentiments and feelings after 9/11, and certainly a different feel in the country during that period of time. So they kind of are connected, but they're a little bit different as well. And then finally, we have the social setting. Now, this is something that I find a lot of newer writers kind of don't always consider, and some of them I've described up here just because they're connected to time period. But essentially, this has to do with the culture of your setting. Now, maybe you have a couple different settings and the culture changes. Maybe you're moving from 1920s rural location to 1930s New York City, but essentially the feel of a place is driven many times not so much by those environmental details, but by the people who are there creating this culture, this socio-cultural environment. So some things that you can take into consideration, I mentioned before, family structures. Consider, and then we'll list some family structures, rituals. That sounds creepy, but it's not. What I mean are, what do weddings look like, funerals, are there coming of age kind of ceremonies, sweet 16 parties, quinceañeras, right? Those are coming of age ceremonies. You could, I suppose, have something different if you were doing a fantasy novel or something set in a different time period. Sometimes harvest, we have Thanksgiving, but other people have different things. Celebration, birthday parties, that kind of thing. Religious beliefs, general social codes of conduct, what's acceptable, what's not. We don't go, the social conduct says that you don't just get out of your car in a traffic jam and go streaking, right? That's something that social contract, you don't do that. If you do, you get arrested, right? Little things, hobbies, values, what people care about, what they do, careers. Again, I mentioned some of these before, and I'll put an etc. here. So generally, these are some things to think about, and I have seen a couple times people write science fiction where they'll have something, let's say in the environment. I'll give you an example. In the environment, you have beings that instead of being bipedal, meaning two legs, they have one leg and they have one arm, and they coming out through the middle, let's say, and they have one eye and an ear right here, and they hop around. Okay, if you have that as part of your setting, so what these creatures are like would, I guess, be part of the social setting, because you're talking about the beings that live there. If you have that, maybe they have escalators that are thinner and they hop on and then they go. Maybe they have maybe they walk in such a way that they're using both their arm and their leg, right? That would be part of the details of that setting. But what I see sometimes is somebody will have a really creative idea like that, but then they don't consider this social setting. So they'll think about what their vehicles would be like, what their buildings would be like. But then they don't think about, do they have, because of this, do they have a different family structure? Do they have different beliefs? Do they have social codes of conduct? If you walk on your arm and your leg, is that like forbidden? Do they not like that? What kind of careers would they have? What kind of hobby? All of these kind of things. There's a great science fiction, well, I don't know. There's a classic science fiction novel called Princess of Mars. And John Carter is from the United States. He's taken through various strange methods up to Mars, and there's two different sides of Martian society. There's the green Martians and there's the red Martians. One have their young with them, and they have these sort of what we would think of as traditional family structures. The other group gives birth to their young in hatcheries, and they're more training their young for war. And so these social settings become very important because you have to know fundamentally from birth the differences between the green Martians and the red Martians and why they're not getting along, right? So it's these kind of things that you need to consider, even if your story is not science fiction and it's taking place maybe even in our world. What is the culture that you are describing? So I'm going to give you a couple examples from literature. I don't have excerpts this time. I'm just going to kind of describe them. Both of these are books from the same author, and they are called Gathering Blue and The Giver. We find out later in these were standalone books that the author decided to make into a series. So we find out later that they take place during the same time period, and that is essentially sometime in the future. Some unspecified time in the future. Some details that they both have in common is that we get the idea that something happened and it caused the culture that we knew, to spell it correctly, to disintegrate. And therefore, a few different societies came up. And out of the ashes, a few different societies were created. So, we'll talk about The Giver first. Some of the details in The Giver. There is, for the most part, people cannot see color. Everything is highly controlled. Everything is planned. We have a high-tech society, so technology is quite important. What does this place look like in terms of it being planned out? Just give those as kind of some general details. As far as it being planned out, there are, it seems like blocks of houses all the same. From what I'm remembering now, a town square, there's a school, but it's extremely planned out. So it's like cookie cutter, right? Everything kind of looks the same. So the town itself is highly planned, as are the other towns they interact with. So we're given a little bit of a hint that there's other towns kind of like this. Then we have a lack of emotion. So that's part of the social setting. The adults take pills to tamp down any sexual desire. So the children are born to birth mothers. That's a job that people have for a few years until they can't give birth anymore, and then assigned to a family unit. The careers are also chosen for the children when they reach the age of 12. So it's a coming of age ceremony. There are other coming of age rituals at different points in a person's childhood, where one of them, at one age they get a bike, at another age the girls have their hair ribbons taken out. There's various things like that. So what you get is this very drab, bleak landscape. If I remember correctly, there is a river nearby. So if you want to talk about those topographical details, the vegetation is highly controlled. So trees that all look the same, that kind of thing. And it is a planned community, and so that is an important part of that story. Now, in Gathering Blue, same time period, totally different setting. We have people living in huts. They have a kind of like a coop that they keep the young children in. I think they call it a pen. They are primarily hunter-gatherer. The women are primarily really the hobbies and jobs are divided by gender. So the women are at home with the tykes. The kids are called tykes. They have really divided up. The men go out to do the hunting. The women are primarily at home cooking. There are some women who are doing weaving in a weaving hut kind of together. They have, to keep the memory alive of what happened, they have a singer who wears a robe and carries a staff that's carved. The robe is embroidered. These things help to show the history because there are no books. There's no technology. This is a society that has clearly kind of gone backwards. So two dystopian worlds, but quite a bit different. And what I find interesting about this book is that they have things like the tykes. They have this thing where people get named. So they have kind of this and other slang. They have things where people are named. So it's the heroine is first Kai, and then as she gets a little bit older in her teen years, she's 2 syllables, and then later on she might be something like Kira Lynn. So we have Matt, who then becomes Matty. We have a 4-syllable, something like that, right? 3 syllables. We have one person who's a 4-syllable name, and that shows how old they are and how revered. Most of the adults are 3, most of the teens are 2, the children are all 1. So it's a little detail like that with the names that helps this book feel more realistic. And that is our word for today: verisimilitude. Both of those places that I'm describing are quite detailed in their setting, and even though they're in this kind of post-apocalyptic fantasy kind of realm, they feel as if they're real. There are a lot of descriptions of the different jobs that are happening in the Giver, the different careers that people are going into. Verisimilitude means that you are adding I could not have that all in bold, adding details to make things seem more realistic. And that is incredibly important as an author when you are creating your setting, because you don't want to have a fantasy world where they're hunters and gatherers and that's all we know about them. So what do the women do? What do the men do? What slang do they use? At one point, Kira goes into a building that has running water, and she's never seen this before. And this is the only building in their village that has this, where the government is kind of housed and where she ends up living. And so she has the benefit of taking a bath for the first time in her life, right? It's those tiny details. The ritual of the name changing from one syllable to two, from going from a tyke to a young person, those kind of things all add to the verisimilitude, to making it seem like it could realistically be happening. So having that detail, making things seem real, all of that can be quite helpful. Okay, so I've pulled up a picture of a fantasy world, just because I think that that'll give us a little bit of help with thinking about things. And I'm going to make it bigger, and then we will talk about the kind of details, if this is sort of the picture you had in your mind, what kind of setting details could you add to make things seem more realistic? So can I zoom in? Oh, I can. That's pretty nice. All right. I wish I knew the artist of this. I think I found this on DeviantArt at one point. Great art there, honestly. And now I'm without your bounds for what you can see. So I find this interesting because clearly, just from a purely topographical point of view, we have some interesting vegetation details here. So large, let's say a person is coming from our world onto this world for the first time. How would they describe it? I don't know what this is, if it's a break in the atmosphere or if it's the shadow of a moon or another planet. So that could kind of be interesting. Clouds swept over the landscape. The mountains in the distance were hazy and seemed almost ethereal. In front of me, I'm just kind of spitballing here. In front of me was almost a swampy kind of lake. I wondered if I could cross it, and there were large, almost tulip-looking flowers, except that they glow like a lightning bug, like the backside of a lightning bug. The structure that I was facing seemed to be woven out of the trunks of trees, forming a canopy over what I could only assume was where the creatures of this world might live. Okay, so that, sorry to jar you out of that so quickly, but that's just some things that I'm coming up with as I'm kind of picturing this place or using this picture as inspiration, right? Let's say that it's not an alien world. Let's say that it is just a general fantasy world set in no particular place, just a made up fantasy world. Maybe there are fairies living in those tulip-looking plants, and that is why they glow. Maybe inside the swirl of green vines that is encased by the woven trees, maybe that is where the fairies hold court, and the fairy queen, or the queen of the fae, lives in that nest, and they protect her kind of like bees would protect a queen. Maybe they have a ritual to choose the queen of the fae, and they're coming together and they're making this structure to just have whatever that ritual looks like. Is it just that they vote? That would be kind of boring, right? Maybe they hold some kind of a trial. Maybe they have people, maybe they have a subset of people who have to come from a particular royal bloodline, and then those people have to go through a trial. Maybe somebody who lives on the outskirts, way up there in the mountains, has come down for this trial and unexpectedly wins. I don't know, but those are some of the details that I would have there. What kind of magic do they have? What are the rules of magic? That would be kind of an important piece, an important part of this setting. Do the rules of magic determine how they can create this little dome structure? Maybe some of them have elemental magic. Maybe some of them have earth magic that they can build these things. Maybe that's part of kind of the, as opposed to the jobs or the career, maybe that's part of it, right? We could think about all of those things as we're building our setting and letting our imagination kind of go. So the last things to consider when you are creating your setting, we talked about verisimilitude. I would add also think about consistency. There we go. So making sure that the details you are adding are consistent throughout the story. Now, sometimes that can be small things. Maybe it's taking place in your hometown and you have somebody driving down Main Street and they pass the library, and then you have them driving down Main Street and there is no library. And unless there's a reason for that, I would try to keep that in mind. Another thing I would like you to think about is whether your story, this shouldn't be a bold because I don't really have a term for this, whether your story and your setting are intimately connected, or whether your story could take place in nearly any setting. Now, neither of these are bad. It's just a choice that you're making as an author. So, for example, if you have something like, did I mention this in another lecture? I might have. But if you have something like A Christmas Carol originally took place in Victorian London, but that basic story of a man who's greedy and three spirits visited him on the eve of Christmas, and he's changed as a result because he's seen his past, his present, his future. That story has been told over and over and over in different cultures, different settings, because human nature doesn't change that much. But if you have a setting where really it can only take place in one particular setting, you might want more setting details in there. You might want to really work on that verisimilitude, adding those details to make it seem more realistic. So, for example, if you have a Western and it is set in Nevada during the gold rush, I want those details of that setting, right? And if you have prospectors and it can't take place in it can't happen in any other place or time, then make sure that you have a lot of description about the environment, maybe some imagery woven in there. You're describing the trees or lack thereof, the cacti, I guess, the mountains, what the color of the dirt looks like, what the prospectors look like, how they are kind of dirty themselves because there's not a lot of water out there and it's mostly men and it's 1800s and people don't take as many baths as we do today, right? So those kind of things add that richness to your story. And if you want to take some setting details out so that it can be a little bit more universal, you can do that too. You have the choice. So, is your story intimately connected to your setting? Are you consistent? Are you using verisimilitude? And are you thinking about those 4 components that we talked about way up here: the social setting, the length of time, the time period, and certainly the environment. That's it. I can't wait to see what you guys come up with this week. Thanks, everyone.